While I was there that night, I was with Suge.
Oh, you were with him. Okay. Do you have any idea who shot Suge?
I'm pretty sure Suge knows who shot Suge.
Yeah. Well, I mean,
so when he comes out of sedation, I'm sure anybody who gets shot will tell you who shot them, right?
Yeah.
But if the police say nobody shot him, I believe nobody shot him. And if nobody shot him, that's the same nobody that shot Tupac. And if nobody shot Tupac, it's the same nobody that shot MLK. And if nobody shot him, that's the same person that shot Malcolm X too. It's a lot of nobodies out there, and nobody minds if nobody comes up missing, right? That don't bother nobody, does it?
Who killed Tupac Shakur, the 25-year-old rapper, considered one of the most influential artists of all time, was gunned down in Las Vegas in 1996. Well, on Friday, Dwayne Keefe D. Davis was indicted on one count of murder with a deadly weapon in relation to...
The moment the new documentary about Sean Diddy Combs began trending on Netflix, millions of viewers expected the same thing: explosive revelations. The project had already been surrounded by rumors, industry whispers, and months of speculation. People assumed it would open doors that had remained closed for years, and in many ways it did. The documentary touched on the rise of one of the most powerful figures in hip-hop, the controversies that followed him, and the complicated web of relationships that surrounded the music industry during its most intense era. But almost immediately after viewers finished the documentary, a strange conversation began spreading online. It wasn't about what the film revealed. It was about what the film seemed to avoid. Because in a story that tries to explore the biggest moments of hip-hop history, one name quietly stayed in the background: Tupac Shakur. For anyone who understands the history of the industry, that silence felt unusual. Tupac wasn't just another rapper. He was one of the most influential artists ever to step into a studio. His rivalry with the East Coast scene shaped an entire generation of music, and his relationship with some of the most powerful figures in the industry has been debated for decades. So when viewers noticed that certain references connected to Tupac seemed strangely absent from the documentary's final cut, curiosity started to grow. Then another clip began resurfacing across the internet. A clip involving comedian Katt Williams. And the moment people watched what he said, the entire discussion changed. Before we go deeper into this story, I want to ask you something. When you watched the documentary, did you feel like something important was missing from the story? Or do you think the filmmakers simply focused on other parts of the industry? Let me know what you think in the comments. And if you're interested in breakdowns like this that look at the details people usually overlook, make sure you subscribe so you don't miss the next investigation. Because once the Katt Williams clip began circulating again, people started looking at the documentary in a completely different way. The clip itself didn't sound dramatic. In fact, Katt Williams didn't raise his voice. He didn't make a direct accusation. Instead, he spoke in the calm tone he often uses when discussing the entertainment industry. But what made the clip powerful was the way he connected a series of moments that many people had stopped questioning. He talked about silence. He talked about proximity to power. And he talked about how certain truths sometimes survive not by being broadcast loudly, but by never being shown at all. For viewers who had already been questioning the documentary's editing choices, those words landed differently. Because documentaries are often presented as neutral storytelling, they give the impression that they're simply collecting facts and presenting them in a clear narrative. But the reality is much more complicated. Every documentary is built through selection. Interviews are recorded, scenes are captured, and hours of footage are produced. But only a small portion of that material ever reaches the audience. Which means every cut, every omission, every moment that disappears shapes the story in ways the viewer may never notice. And that's where things started getting interesting. According to multiple discussions surrounding the documentary's production, the project involved a massive amount of recorded footage, interviews with insiders, commentary from people who had been present during key moments in hip-hop history, conversations about events that had shaped the culture for decades. But not everything made it to the final version. Entire segments were removed. Certain discussions never appeared. And somewhere within those edits, references connected to Tupac reportedly disappeared as well. Now, to be clear, editing decisions happen in every film. No documentary can include everything. Producers constantly balance pacing, storytelling clarity, and legal considerations. But when viewers started comparing earlier interviews, resurfaced clips, and statements from people who had participated in the production process, a new question started forming. What exactly had been left out, and why? That question becomes even more interesting when you look at how Tupac's story intersects with the broader history of the music industry during that era. Because Tupac wasn't just involved in one rivalry or one moment of controversy. His career unfolded during a time when the industry itself was undergoing massive changes. Record labels were becoming more powerful. Artists were competing for influence across regions. And behind the scenes, alliances and tensions were constantly shifting. In that environment, relationships between artists, executives, and entire record labels became incredibly complicated. And some of those relationships still raise questions today. That's part of the reason why the resurfacing of Katt Williams' comments caught people's attention. Over the years, he has developed a reputation for speaking openly about the entertainment industry in ways that other public figures tend to avoid. Sometimes those comments sound exaggerated. Sometimes they sound philosophical. But every once in a while, he says something that makes people pause and reconsider events they thought they already understood. In this particular moment, what he said didn't accuse anyone directly. Instead, he framed the issue in a way that shifted the entire conversation. He suggested that the most important parts of a story aren't always the things that appear on screen. Sometimes the most revealing details are the ones that quietly disappear before the audience ever sees them. And once viewers began looking at the documentary through that lens, the discussion started spreading rapidly across social media. People began revisiting old interviews. Clips from past conversations resurfaced. And suddenly, moments from hip-hop history that had been sitting quietly in archives started attracting attention again. One of those moments involved the complicated atmosphere surrounding the industry during the years when Tupac's influence was at its peak. At the time, tensions between different parts of the hip-hop world had become highly visible. Rivalries between artists were no longer confined to music. Interviews, public appearances, and media coverage amplified every disagreement. Fans followed the drama closely, often interpreting lyrics, comments, and rumors as pieces of a larger narrative. And inside that environment, certain events became defining moments that people still debate today. But here's where the situation becomes even more complicated. Over time, stories from that era have been told and retold so many times that separating verified facts from interpretation can become extremely difficult. Different witnesses remember events differently. Interviews from different years sometimes contradict each other. And in some cases, the people who were present during those moments have chosen not to speak publicly at all. Which means the story continues evolving depending on which voices are included and which ones are not. That's exactly why the editing choices in a documentary can carry so much weight. Because when a filmmaker decides which interviews to highlight, which clips to include, and which discussions to leave behind, they aren't just shaping entertainment. They're shaping the version of history that millions of viewers will accept as the official narrative. And according to people who began examining the production more closely, the documentary that sparked this entire conversation may have left out more than viewers initially realized. Some insiders have suggested that entire timelines were condensed. Others have hinted that certain discussions became legally complicated. And a few people have implied that parts of the story may have simply been considered too sensitive to include in a mainstream release. If that's true, then Katt Williams' resurfaced comments take on a very different meaning. Because suddenly, his remarks about silence and selective storytelling start sounding less like philosophical observations and more like a subtle warning about how power operates inside the entertainment industry. And if that interpretation is correct, then the real mystery might not be what the documentary showed. The real mystery might be what the audience was never meant to see. And once you start looking at the story from that perspective, another question begins to appear. A question that connects the documentary, the resurfaced interviews, and decades of unresolved debate surrounding one of the most famous figures in hip-hop history. What if the missing pieces of this story were never meant to disappear, but were simply moved out of sight? And if that's the case, then the next step in this investigation becomes unavoidable. Because understanding why certain moments vanish from a documentary requires going back to the environment where those moments originally happened. The rivalries, the alliances, and the conversations that were taking place behind closed doors long before the cameras ever started recording. And when you begin looking at that period of time more closely, something interesting starts to appear. Something that may explain why certain parts of the story still make people uncomfortable today. And when you rewind the story far enough, you start to notice something that most people miss the first time around. It wasn't just the music that was competing back then. It was narratives. It was influence. It was control over what the public believed and what the public never questioned. That's why the Tupac name still carries a different kind of weight. Even today, mention Tupac in the wrong context and people don't just remember him. They react. They argue. They pick sides. They dig up old footage like it's evidence in an ongoing trial. And that's exactly what happened when the internet realized the Netflix documentary didn't feel as complete as it was marketed to be. Because the moment people started comparing the final documentary to clips that existed outside of it, the gaps became the story. A segment here that feels shortened. A conversation there that suddenly jumps forward. A timeline that seems smoothed out. And when audiences sense smoothing, they instinctively ask one question: who benefits from the clean version? This is where the Katt Williams clip becomes more than just a viral moment. Because Katt doesn't talk like someone trying to prove a point. He talks like someone who's watched how the machine works. He frames things as patterns, not one-off incidents. And when he references how nobody gets blamed, he isn't simply making a joke. He's pointing at a psychological trick that keeps repeating. When responsibility becomes blurry, accountability becomes optional. That's important because documentaries don't just cut footage for pacing. They cut it for clarity. They cut it for legal safety. They cut it for relationships. Sometimes they cut it for access. And sometimes they cut it because one moment, one sentence, one implication can pull an entire project into a new category of risk. Now think about Netflix for a second. A platform like that is not just distributing content. It's distributing liability. It's distributing reputations. It's distributing a story that will be watched, clipped, reposted, and analyzed by millions of people who will treat it as a reference point. So if a documentary is going to touch a sensitive thread, especially one tied to a legendary figure whose name still triggers industry tension, then every second on screen has to be considered like a decision in a courtroom. That doesn't mean the scene was cut because it was true. That doesn't mean it was cut because it was false. It means it was cut because it was powerful enough to cause consequences. And in the entertainment world, consequences don't always arrive in a straight line. Sometimes they arrive as phone calls. Sometimes they arrive as legal letters. Sometimes they arrive as people quietly refusing to cooperate in the future. Sometimes they arrive as a distributor asking the filmmakers, "Can you support this? Can you defend this? Can you prove it?" And that's where the Tupac thread becomes dangerous. Because Tupac's story isn't just about his final night. It's about everything around it. The rivalries, the people who were near him, the people who benefited from his rise, the people who benefited from his absence, and the decades of arguments that followed. So when a Diddy documentary becomes mainstream and trending, and then viewers notice Tupac references are thin or missing, people don't just see an editing choice. They see a boundary, a line that the documentary didn't want to cross. And once that idea lands in the audience's mind, they start hunting for the missing material. They start asking, was there more footage? Was there a longer interview? Was there a segment that got pulled after it was already assembled? Was there a conversation that made the final cut at first, but then disappeared before release? This is where another layer adds fuel. People involved in media often talk about hours of footage being recorded that never makes it to air. That's normal. But when fans hear that a project had massive amounts of raw material, and then they sense the final narrative is oddly narrow, they interpret the leftover footage differently. They stop seeing it as extra. They start seeing it as suppressed. And even if that interpretation isn't fair, it's predictable because the audience knows something. If you filmed it, it existed. If it existed, it could have been shown. If it wasn't shown, someone decided it was safer not to. Now let's talk about why Tupac's name, specifically, raises the stakes in a Diddy-focused documentary. Because for years, people have argued about proximity, who was in the same rooms, who was at the same events, who crossed paths and how they reacted. Fans obsess over tiny details, who left early, who avoided who suddenly disappeared in a moment when tension was high. And those details matter because they build an emotional narrative. Not legal proof, not court evidence, emotional narrative. The kind that spreads faster than facts because it makes people feel like they're seeing the hidden side of history. The script you shared includes an example of that kind of storytelling. Someone describing a tense environment, a moment where people were watching each other, and then one person vanishing from the scene. That single image does a lot of work. It doesn't prove anything, but it plants a question in the viewer's mind. Why would someone move like that? What did they know? What did they fear? What were they trying to avoid? And that's exactly why a documentary might hesitate to include it. Because when you put that on Netflix, you're not just airing a story. You're inviting millions of people to interpret behavior as motive. And once that happens, the documentary becomes less of a film and more of a spark. Now zoom out again. There's also the business side. Documentaries rely on interviews, access, and cooperation. If a film goes too far, too openly, too aggressively, it can shut doors for future projects. People in the industry remember. They keep notes. They decide who gets access next time. So a producer might think, if we include this, what happens next? Will someone refuse to clear footage? Will someone threaten a lawsuit? Will the platform demand extra legal vetting? Will a key voice back out? Will the story shift from documentary to accusation? And if that's the tension behind the scenes, then it suddenly makes sense why the most loaded references get trimmed first. Because the goal becomes simple: tell a version of the story that can survive release. But here's the twist. The moment you cut the loaded parts, you create a different problem. The audience feels the cut. They might not know exactly what's missing, but they feel that the story is stepping around something. And the internet hates when it senses avoidance. That's why after the documentary trended, the conversation didn't die down. It intensified. People started sharing older clips, older interviews, old statements from different figures, connecting them like dots on a wall. And when Katt Williams' words resurfaced in the middle of that wave, it didn't feel random. It felt like a missing puzzle piece sliding into place. Because his whole point, whether people agree with him or not, was simple. Sometimes the loudest truth is the one that never makes it to the screen. And that leaves us with the question that pushes this story forward. If the Tupac thread was sensitive enough to cut, what exactly did it point toward? And who would want it softened before millions watched? The more people examined that question, the clearer something became. The conversation was no longer about one documentary. It was about the larger system that decides how certain stories are told. Because the entertainment industry has always had two different versions of history running at the same time. There is the public version, the one presented through documentaries, interviews, official statements, and carefully edited narratives. And then there is the version that lives in fragments. Old interviews, unreleased clips, conversations remembered differently by people who were in the same room but walked away with completely different interpretations of what happened. When those two versions start drifting apart, audiences begin looking for the missing bridge between them. That's exactly what started happening once viewers returned to the older footage surrounding Tupac's era in the industry. One detail that kept resurfacing was the atmosphere that existed during that time. The industry wasn't just competitive, it was tense. Rivalries between artists weren't simply marketing strategies. They were deeply personal. Interviews from that period often show artists speaking in ways that sound measured, almost cautious, as if every word might trigger a reaction somewhere else. And that's what makes some of Tupac's old statements so interesting when people revisit them today. In certain interviews, he hinted at knowing things he chose not to explain publicly. His tone sometimes shifted between frustration and restraint. Instead of making direct accusations, he would talk around topics, implying that the full story couldn't be told in a simple conversation. At the time, many fans interpreted those moments as emotional reactions tied to the chaos of the music industry. But years later, those same interviews started looking different. They started looking like someone choosing their words carefully. That shift in interpretation is important because it connects directly to the editing decisions that sparked the current conversation. If a documentary includes interviews that hint at unresolved conflicts, then every viewer begins asking the same question: what exactly were those conflicts about? And once that question appears, the documentary risks opening doors that the filmmakers might not have intended to open. That's why the resurfacing of multiple voices, not just Katt Williams, started pulling attention toward the same idea. People like Gene Deal, for example, have spent years discussing the atmosphere that surrounded major figures in hip-hop during that era. Instead of focusing on single events, he often describes patterns: rivalries that felt personal, alliances that seemed temporary, and tensions that sometimes appeared beneath the surface even during public appearances. Those kinds of descriptions don't function like courtroom evidence. They operate more like texture. They give context to the environment in which major events unfolded. But context can be powerful, because once viewers understand the environment, they start reinterpreting moments that previously looked ordinary. A hesitation during an interview, a person leaving a location earlier than expected, an artist suddenly changing tone when discussing another figure. Each small detail becomes a potential clue inside a much larger story. That's why documentaries sometimes face a difficult choice. The deeper they go into context, the more questions they create. And questions can be unpredictable. One question leads to another, then another. Soon the narrative that began as a biography or investigation starts expanding into something much broader than the filmmakers originally planned. For a global streaming platform, that kind of expansion can become risky. Because the more layers a story gains, the harder it becomes to control how viewers interpret it. One viewer may see historical context. Another viewer may see implication. Another viewer may see accusation. And once millions of people start debating interpretations online, the story stops belonging to the filmmakers. It becomes something else entirely, a cultural debate that evolves faster than anyone involved in the production can respond. That possibility may explain why certain moments are softened or removed during editing. Not necessarily because the information is incorrect, but because it points in directions the documentary isn't prepared to explore. And this is where the idea Katt Williams hinted at becomes difficult to ignore. If the most controversial threads of a story are removed before release, the final documentary can appear complete while still avoiding the most complicated questions. To the average viewer, the film feels polished and coherent. But to people familiar with the deeper history, the absence becomes visible. They notice which conversations never happen. They notice which names are mentioned briefly instead of explored fully. They notice when the timeline moves forward just as the story approaches a sensitive moment. And once that pattern is recognized, audiences begin filling the gaps themselves. That process has already started happening around the documentary. Fans, commentators, and longtime followers of hip-hop history have begun comparing the film with older interviews, archived footage, and discussions that circulated years before the documentary existed. The result is something the filmmakers probably expected, but could never completely prevent. The story is growing beyond the documentary itself. Because the more people revisit the history surrounding Tupac, the more they begin asking the same question that started this entire conversation. Not simply what happened during that era, but why certain parts of the story continue to fade in and out of the public spotlight depending on who is telling it. And once that question enters the conversation, it naturally leads to one final possibility. Maybe the missing Tupac references in the documentary weren't just removed because they complicated the narrative. Maybe they were removed because including them would have forced the documentary to follow a trail that leads much further than anyone involved in the project was ready to go. And if that possibility is true, then the missing moments in the documentary start looking less like simple editing decisions and more like deliberate boundaries. Because every documentary eventually reaches a point where the filmmakers have to decide how far they are willing to follow a story. Some paths lead to answers. Others lead to more questions than anyone can comfortably handle. When a film touches the history of hip-hop, Especially an era filled with rivalries, powerful personalities, and unresolved debates, those decisions become even more complicated. One detail can reopen a conversation that people have spent years trying to move past. One resurfaced interview can send audiences back through decades of footage searching for connections. And that may be exactly what the creators of the documentary were trying to avoid. By focusing on certain chapters of the industry and leaving others in the background, the final film tells a version of the story that feels complete without reopening the most sensitive threads. But once viewers noticed the silence around Tupac, the conversation changed. Because silence can sometimes draw more attention than any scene ever could. Now people are revisiting old interviews, old statements, and old moments from that era with fresh eyes. They're comparing what was shown with what was left out, trying to understand where the documentary chose to stop, and why. Maybe the truth is exactly what it appears to be, a documentary that simply chose a different focus. Or maybe the missing references hint at a deeper layer of the story that still makes the industry uncomfortable to explore. What do you think? Do you believe the Tupac references were removed for storytelling reasons, or because they pointed toward questions the documentary didn't want to answer? Share your thoughts below, and if you enjoy investigations that dig into the details behind major stories like this, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next breakdown.